Good evening, everyone. I'm Hans Engel from the Directors Guild of Canada. Welcome to our fourth episode of DGC Masterclass via Zoom, bringing you together with some of the most interesting creatives in the industry today. The DGC prides itself on being the place where the creative community of the industry comes together to celebrate and discuss the work. The current global crisis has thrust us all online like never before. Trying to see this as an opportunity, we're reaching out to creatives we might have previously not been able to bring you. We're going behind the scenes and talking to some of the top creatives in the industry, covering directors, designers, picture and sound editors, with a new episode every Thursday. You'll receive a new invitation every week with a specific link to tune in. So far, we've had Emmy-winning director Jean-Marc Vallée, Emmy-winning editor Kelly Dixon, and Oscar-winning designers David and Sandy Wasco. Tonight is billed as a special presentation, not only because it's Wednesday instead of our usual Thursday, but also because it's happening in lieu of a live event we'd planned to celebrate the opening of Jeff Barnaby's new film, Blood Quantum. That's obviously and unfortunately not happening. I was very excited to be part of bringing this film to an audience, particularly our audience made up of you professional artists and filmmakers, because it's one of the most unique and fascinating films I've personally seen in a long time. And in my mind, Jeff Barnaby is one of the most exciting filmmakers working today. Don't blush, Jeff. It was released everywhere online on Monday, and I hope you'll seek it out. Jeff Barnaby was born on a Micmac reserve in Listegouche, Quebec. He's worked as an artist, poet, author, and filmmaker. His work uses unsettling elements of the horror and sci-fi genres to paint a stark and scathing portrait of post-colonial Aboriginal life and culture. His short films, File Under Miscellaneous, From Cherry English, and The Colony, led to his debut feature film, the cult hit Rhymes for Young Ghouls. Blood Quantum is his sophomore feature film, and it's also frighteningly prophetic. I kept his bio short because there's so much more to Jeff and his work, and it's much better the way he tells it. So welcome, Jeff.
Hi everybody who I can't see.
And I'm equally thrilled that we could include Jesse Wente tonight. Jesse Wente is an Ojibwe writer, broadcaster, speaker, and arts leader. Born and raised in Toronto, he's a member of the Serpent River First Nation. Jesse's best known for his 24 years as a columnist for CBC Radio's Metro Morning. Jesse spent 11 years with TIFF, the last 7 as the director of film programs at the TIFF Bell Lightbox. Jesse's currently co-producing his first film, a screen adaptation of Thomas King's best-selling book, The Inconvenient Indian. An outspoken advocate for Indigenous rights and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit art, he's spoken at the International Forum of Indigenous Peoples, Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, the Canadian Arts Summit, the Cultural Summit of the Americas, and numerous universities and colleges. All true. In November 2020, Jesse delivered the annual Eva Holtby Lecture on Contemporary Culture at the Royal Ontario Museum. Jesse currently serves on the board of directors for the Canada Council for the Arts. In 2017, he was named the inaugural recipient of the Real World Film Festival's Real Activist Award, and recently received the Association of Ontario Health Centres Media Award for 2018. Jesse's currently working on his first book for Penguin Random House Canada, and Jesse was named the first executive director of the Indigenous Screen Office in February 2018. Welcome, Jesse.
Christ, that's like the whole fucking Wikipedia, that thing. Jesus Christ.
That's the bio you read before a roast.
I mean, like, my goodness, what a nightmare, Jeff.
Before I turn these guys loose, I'd like to point out to the audience the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to send in questions throughout the masterclass by using that button and typing it into the box. Jesse will try to get to as many questions as he can, but may not and likely won't be able to ask them all. Have a fantastic conversation. I'll pop back in at the end. Over to you, Jesse and Jeff.
Well, thank you so much, Hans, for that exhaustive introduction. I appreciate it. And welcome everyone who I also can't see. And welcome Jeff. Jeff and I have known each other we were trying to figure it out, but it's many, many years at this point. And whenever we've done many of these sorts of things, although not quite in this sort of setup, and I find that it's like a continuing conversation that Jeff and I have been carrying on for all those years. We just pick it up right where it left off. So folks, this will be somewhat casual and a chat between friends, but I'm certainly looking forward to it. And congratulations, Jeff, on the release of Blood Quantum yesterday. What a great moment to finally arrive.
Yeah, it was a tremendous relief to actually have it out there. And there's a kind of a grace period. It kind of feels like, the moment you get sentenced and the moment you have that sentence executed, waiting, that feels really tense for me anyway, because I wasn't sure what I had. You can't really gauge it with any other films. I knew like the zombie gags were good, but I didn't know if the politics would translate well. So I was really worried. And when the first, reviews started coming in, it was, you can almost make the argument that it wasn't the target audience, because the film did quite an extensive tour of film festivals in Europe. And, Europe, while a great film community, safe to say probably not that keen or at least knowledgeable on contemporary Native issues anyway. So I think a lot of the politics were lost on people, which is kind of weird, right? I mean, Europe is like the home of the settler, but there's no actual, there's actually no acknowledgement of the history there, really.
Yeah, they're not very self-realized on the history of colonialism.
No, and we have that fucking problem here too, right? Because it's like I need to give a little bit of almost a class on how to understand the politics of my film. I mean, we kind of had to do it with rhymes, where you put that quote at the beginning from the Indian Act, and we wanted to do it for Blood Quantum too, but it was like, well, how do you really define that? Because every tribe has its own definition, and some tribes are supportive of it, and some tribes aren't, and some people are, and some people aren't. And it's such a huge topic to unpack in something like a zombie film. And I was really worried that people would be lost and confused. And there are some people who have been, but I think predominantly here in the US, or here in Canada, and here in the US, or in the US, it's been well received.
And what is it like releasing the film like this? I mean, we, as Hans had suggested off the top, we were supposed to do this live and in person some weeks ago when the movie was going to come out in March. Now it's released sort of digitally. You don't get the theatrical. What's that been like for you this time around?
I don't really know what to gauge the experience on, because I've never really released a film theatrically. I've attended premieres at like TIFF and prestigious festivals, but I've never released a film theatrically. And I don't really know what that's like, so I don't really know what I'm missing. And I really genuinely believe that the way we released it, although may not garner as much money, because you're talking about one person ordering it and the whole family watching it versus all those people buying single tickets, I think the reception is better, and I think the overall, like the overall people seeing it has been higher too. So I think while the theatrical release would have been nice, I don't think as many people would have seen it, and I'm not 100% sure the response to it would have been as strong if we didn't have the virus to bring into relief all the politics in the film. So it seems like at first blush to be a travesty, or not a travesty, but a tragedy, that this film that we worked on for decades didn't get released. But I think it all feels very serendipitous, like it was all meant to be this way. And I feel like the reception justifies the release. And I'm just happy that Shudder's happy. I'm happy that the people that put their money in got the money back. filmmaker stuff, right? I'm not really thinking about it in artistic terms. Just like, all right, I get to make another movie now, probably.
Well, you should be very proud of all of that and the artistry of the film as well. Do you find a difference? Because, you know, this was a movie that played a bunch of festivals, you know, as you were saying last year, played TIFF, you know, opened Midnight Madness, played Imaginative. Is there a difference between the audience reception for you as the filmmaker in a festival setting versus now that it's out and everyone's watching it on iTunes?
I find festivals are more receptive. Like, if you've ever been to a Midnight Madness screening, those guys are ready to watch probably anything. So they're going to be primed to really get into a film like this.
But those can also be harsh critics, those Midnight Madness audiences.
I think so too, because it was a weird screening. It wasn't necessarily bad, but I felt the scrutiny. I felt the scrutiny of the audience, whereas I felt like I had the mantle of being a first-time filmmaker when Rhymes came out. So like, I'm sure the expectations were low. So when the film came out, it was like, this guy actually knows what to do with a camera, and you know, he's not terrible. So I think that raised the expectations for Blood Quantum a little bit, plus getting that coveted pole position at the Midnight Madness. I think the expectations for the film were high. And that made me a little nervous because I knew for a fucking fact that probably at least half the audience wasn't really going to get all the nuances of the film. And that didn't really worry me so much, but I think at some point you don't want to lose your audience. So I always tried to temper that with just classic zombie kills, like classic cool zombie moments. And that was the idea, was to, if you get the politics, you get them. But if you don't, hey, this motherfucker's gonna get their head sawed in half. This guy's gonna get his dick bit off. Gonna be some dead babies later. So you get all these touchstones of what would be considered classic horror, but you're still looking at it through this revisionist lens that is the native perspective. And I think that was really what I was kind of hoping. The novelty of it all and the familiarity of some of the zombie awesomeness would carry the audience past not knowing the politics of indigenous peoples. Fucking, it was a tightrope to walk, man. Honestly, it was like, I don't think white filmmakers have to deal with this shit. Put it bluntly. I don't think they need to explain stuff to their audience and you know, hope that they get it. And you know, it's kind of weird. I've been watching Downton Abbey, and I really, really like it. And
it's great.
Yeah, I've been kind of liking it like a National Geographic show for white people. And I began to understand the culture better just by watching that fucking show. And I get it, man. It's like, this is why representation matters. It's like you get authentic representation of these rich, really insanely out of touch people. Like, what's a weekend? And you know, it's like, it's fascinating. So I really began to understand how you could really look into somebody's other culture, like some of these cultures, and be completely lost, but at the same time completely enraptured and fascinated.
Of course, it's that, you know, it's the normalization of that perspective that allows that no explanation is then required. You know, it's that there's a certain point of view that is the normal point of view, and that doesn't require explanation. But as soon as you step out of that, then you do need to explain. And I agree with you. I don't think all filmmakers, all artists, period, all storytellers get the equal shakes. And I was wondering, like, your film strikes me as something, and this is sort of a different nuance to that, similar to, say, when I watched Get Out, which, you know, I watched with a primarily white audience once, and then I went to a theater where I would watch it with a primarily non-white audience. Two very different viewing experiences of that film. And I would suspect that Blood Quantum operates much the same way, that for an indigenous audience, there's moments where we might laugh or laugh even knowingly, where other audiences may not quite get what's funny. in a given moment.
Like Waylon Jennings, the Waylon Jennings song. I remember talking to John, and John's like, "Why the fuck do you want to put a Waylon Jennings song?" It's like, Jesus, dude, do you know how big Waylon Jennings is on his roof? And there's this weird thing too, or this little side story with Waylon Jennings, that he has a really close tie to the Navajos in Arizona. And it was actually my wife, who is Navajo, that convinced me to use the song. And it's little beats like that, or the casual way they're dealing with zombies, like all this stuff that I think you appreciate as a Native filmmaker or a Native audience member. And I think the real big thing too that I saw, where there was a difference, was the old man's the denouement of the old man, where he makes that final stand at the end, and people talked about it like it was like a cliche, meaningless stand, and it's like, no, it isn't. It's not a cliche, meaningless stand. Here's a World War II veteran that spent probably a good period of his adult life fighting a war, and he comes back only to fight a war again, and he just didn't want to leave that second time. The ties to the land and the people that were still there were what kept him there. It wasn't really any misplaced sacrifice to get these guys gone. He just didn't want to leave. And I think a lot of people didn't wrap their head around that. And it's just like, you can't explain something that you don't feel when you're in your own community. And I think if there's a harsh criticism to lay against Western culture, is that it feels very spiritualist right now. It feels like the spirituality, there is no spirituality towards land. I mean, I think that's pretty blatant. But it almost feels like that separation is kind of what contributed to the climate crisis we're in right now. It's like there was a disconnect between realizing that anything you do to your surroundings is going to be done unto you, which is basically the premise of Blood Quantum. I mean, it's an environmental catastrophe film.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think really capitalism, when you live in that system, allows you to view any resource, natural or otherwise, as anything but a profit center. And so I think that worldview becomes really hard to shake, and it means that any alternate worldview can be ununderstandable. You know, it just doesn't compute, especially when we spent so long being conditioned in that way. Do you consider the different audiences when you're telling a story ever, like at any point?
Absolutely. I kind of say this is meant for, let's look at Native cinema over the course of, past 30, 40 years or whatever. Typically, you're going to need a white guide. You're going to need a white person in there to guide you through the Native topography. I kind of want to do an equivalent thing of that by using familiar zombie tropes. The police officer, the nurse, the pregnant woman. I wanted to use these characters that you've seen in zombie films before, so the non-Native audience would at least feel some degree of familiarity. But from that point on, it's taking all those tropes and just flipping them on their ass. And it's like the entire script of Blood Quantum approach to filmmaking was irony and having the power shift towards the Native people and seeing how these Native people would play out, either sticking to their more traditional ways or kind of embracing this post-colonial anger that you see. Actually, I was thinking about that too when I was listening to it, post-colonial, as if it ended.
It's not over.
Yeah, it's not over. So I think when you look at somebody like a colonized character in the film, the Lysol character, I understand why a non-Native audience member wouldn't grasp why he's so fucking angry by the contents of the film, but I wouldn't understand that from a Native perspective. Because I think people need to see, like a non-Native audience really needs to see the beats on the screen, whereas I think a Native audience would see the environment as the hostile, entity. Whereas I think a lot of non-native people just take it for granted that, that's just a town and that's just, that's the places we live. But I think when you're in a small town in a native community, you have quite an antagonistic relationship typically with the community, the non-native community that you're living beside. But I mean, all that to say, I mean, I did want to make a popcorn movie and had no intent on kind of making another, blame the white guys are evil movie. And I felt like the Lysol character really was an anti-hero because everything he does may be evil adjacent. Say that. But I think his actions in and of themselves come from a place of wanting to protect his community, but being such a spoiled man, like a colonized native man. He really doesn't know how to do that anymore. So he reverts back to misogyny and toxic masculinity, and like the harsh reality is, I think native men revert back to that specifically because they don't know how to be vulnerable without being taken advantage of. So I mean, it's a lot to unpack, man, because the Lysol character, I mean, he's representative of his own experience, but he's also representative of everything that person, the Lysol character growing up on a reserve with a broken family and being in foster care would experience. I mean, he's speaking for a lot of young Native men and women.
Before we get too in depth into the story, maybe it's worth us or you explaining a little bit, just maybe the sort of outline sketch in case there's people watching that haven't actually yet seen the movie. It's in their Apple's tune, like, what are you waiting for, people? But let's just let, like, I don't know if you want to do it or you want me to do it, but give it a quick elevator pitch of what it's about.
It's about a young Native man who gets his young non-Native girlfriend pregnant. On the same day, the zombie apocalypse happens. You flash forward in time and you realize that the zombie apocalypse doesn't affect the Native people on the reserve. And they have the dilemma of whether or not to help the people from the non-Native community or to treat them as well, terrorists, really. if you want to use a buzzword, if you want to use a hot button word, and antics ensue, hijinks ensue. I think would be. I'm terrible at explaining my own films because I'm so bogged down in the allegory.
Well, let me give it a shot. It's about an indigenous community beset by infected invaders from outside who threaten everything inside. Is that about right?
Yeah.
So in other words, it's the story of Canada and the US.
Yes, it's the retelling of the colonization story easily. That is easily what it is. And I've always wanted to do it, right? And everybody wants to do those stories of what would natives do if they knew better. And that's kind of what it was. And it's not, and it becomes a spiritual debate. It really does. Do you embrace the anger of colonization and let it twist you up? Or do you stay true to your heritage and keep your arms and your heart open to outside people that need your help? And that in and of itself becomes a fucking commentary on the entire refugee and immigration system here and how it plays in relief to colonization and the hypocrisy involved. It becomes this monster just by virtue of that small dynamic of making these guys immune to the zombie plague. And I've been saying this all day when we've been doing interviews. You would be 100% remiss to not think the evolution of the virus in North America didn't correlate perfectly with the evolution of colonization. The two are inextricably linked. And the irony of all this is you see this virus, this smallpox, and all these other horrible diseases that help give a foothold to non-Indigenous people in Canada and North America. It very well may be a virus that undoes it all, that actually starts really showing in stark contrast the disparities between the rich and the poor and the black and the white, the brown and the white. And I think this cannot continue. Something is going to happen. I don't know what it is. I think it's just going to be out of left field and unpredictable as the virus, but it definitely feels like we've had this particular form of culture, capitalism, late stage capitalism, colonialism, whatever the fuck you want to call it. I feel like it's hit its apex and it's been on its downward trend for a while. And it's time to move on and find out what's next. And you're starting to see stuff like this. I think that's the whole cornerstone of apocalyptic cinema and stories, is to flirt with the fantasy of toppling the whole fucking system down without having to come out from behind the protection of white privilege and white power, colonization. What the fuck do they think is going to happen? Like, like we're going to like take up arms and storm the parliament or something? Like, it's just, for the benefit of everybody involved, we need to move forward together. Like, how the fuck is that so obtuse to people?
Well, this is perhaps why it's, well, perhaps not, certainly not ideal, not without irony or connection that the movie comes out when there is actually a global pandemic, and when there is a virus that I think actually is attacking some of the basis for a lot of those sort of cultural beliefs. I mean, this is a virus that very clearly is angry with capitalism because it decided to close the economy and try to reset everyone and remind us that capitalism is separate from community, that those are two separate things and often at odds. You know, so I think it's interesting in this moment that, well, I was actually going to come on this show, Jeff, and say, how dare you unleash this plague on the world?
I think you cannot not blame this on consumption of the natural world. We're fucking around in places we shouldn't be, and all these things that would never come into contact with each other otherwise are creating these new deadly, I mean, like, you cannot make this stuff up. If indeed you were a spiritual person that, say, believed the earth was indeed an animal, what better way to heal itself than to take off its biggest parasite, which is fucking people? I mean, it's like, this isn't, Native people are animists and know this inherently. Like, even if you don't believe or have a spiritual side, you're an atheist or whatever, you cannot deny the correlation between mass consumption of our ecosystems with disease and overpopulation and everything that humanity is doing wrong as a collective. I mean, that's a lot of shit to unpack for a zombie film, but that's kind of all the stuff that we're kind of looking at and touching upon, while at the same time never really losing sight of the fact that it's a hardcore zombie film.
No, I think you get, I mean, for me, that was always what I loved, even before you ever made this movie, talking to you about it, all those over the years, was that you always had the vision of bringing the politics back to the zombie movie. And the zombie movie, at least in the conception of the modern zombie movie, you know, where Romero really made them, starting in, you know, 1968 with Night, you know, those films were very political. George was a political filmmaker who just knew how to, you know, have the human body destroyed on film in very interesting ways. And so I appreciate the fact that the film is political and yet you still got the chainsaw. You know, I think that those are important things.
I think one of the great things that Romero did that nobody really, well, I think a lot of people acknowledge, but it's you know, when you talk about Night of the Living Dead, you kind of appreciate it in a modern context and forget that that was a black man in the lead in 1969. I mean, like, holy shit. And at no one point does any white character in the film really acknowledge it, because he was never meant to be black. He was just the best actor that showed up. And that changed the political complexion of the entire film. And I think if you're a George Romero fan and you know this and you see this and you learn from it, how the fuck do you not put natives in a zombie film? How do you not do that? Because it's like, they represent, like, any time, and this is even by our own design. This is by basically white people doing it for the past 100 years, putting natives on cinema in a political to represent a political ideology. In this case, it's like capitalism and colonialism is awesome. So I think when you start doing that with native people as a native director, all those politics are coming there anyway. And for me, that was a kind of blessing in disguise, because then I was basically trying to do the same thing, where it's like, look at all these Indians that nobody's really acknowledging. Not really, not there was no like there was no blatant fights about race. I could really, that they didn't have to confront organically in the screenplay. That was the idea of making the virus a virus, because it's fucking indiscriminate. It doesn't care about your social background or anything like that. But when you start making these native people immune, you immediately bring into all this, bring into the content of the film all this history of colonialism. And it's just like, I can't sit there. I think any artist, any writer, director, well, maybe not a director, but people that work spontaneously, musicians would be a good example, will tell you that when a good idea comes to you, it's not yours. You're experiencing it in the moment. And that's what writing Blood Quantum was like. It started with, I want to do a zombie movie. How do we circumvent the saturation of the zombie market with making the natives immune to the zombie plague? Like, John and I were sitting in a hotel room after the colony during TIFF. What do we do next? Because we thought, hey, they're just going to hand us money to do a feature now. Nope. It was like, I've always wanted to do a zombie movie. You're a fucking guy that grew up in the 80s. Of course you want to do a zombie movie as a filmmaker. So it's like, let's do it. And then it just stemmed from, what if we make the natives immune to zombie plague? Then it was like, let's look who's coming to dinner, but it's zombies. And it's like everything from that moment on wrote itself. Because when you look at the news footage of any protest about pipelines or any other bullshit, it's like, it harkens to imagery of zombie films, like the opening to Dawn of the Dead, Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, all the protests and stuff. I mean, fuck, that's him flirting with the idea of it being political, but not really. But when you start transposing those ideas and putting them in the realm of native experience, those blockades start taking on multiple meanings. It's not just a snowblower for gags. I mean, it is, but it isn't. So I think we did a really good job. I'm proud of the job we did of walking that line of making the audience aware, but not pulpit dumping, turning off the audience and making them feel like they're being lectured.
Yeah, for sure. I think you absolutely pulled that off. And I was struck, Romero was the first to connect zombies with capitalism. He did that in Dawn of the Dead.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you saw that image from one of the protests, the Open the Country protests in the US, where it looked like a Dawn of the Dead, like he was very much ahead of his time and called this. Yeah, exactly. And I'm wondering, because I always feel that Indigenous people globally we are inherently political because our existence has been politicized, not by us, but by colonialism and others. And I'm just wondering, does that mean that, all Indigenous films are just inherently political, that there's no escaping it?
I think until you normalize it, until you normalize Native people on screen where they can just fucking exist, you know what I mean? Like, we don't have to, like, Spike Lee, I'm sure, would like to do a film. It took him a while to get to Crooklyn. You know what I mean? He still had to do, like, do the right thing, and he still had to do.
And that wasn't even originally his movie, Crooklyn.
Yeah, exactly. It was Scorsese, right?
Yeah.
So it was like I almost feel like you need to normalize seeing Native people on screen in order to move them into just being human beings, not like allegories for any kind of political movement. I haven't even seen anybody. I mean, talk about genre movies. The first person to do that, to normalize a Native person in a film. I mean, you could say Die Hard 2, but I mean, with a native
Three,
director.
Die Hard 3.
Yeah, Die Hard 3 with a native director. I mean, that's ultimately the goal, right? Where you're appreciating people for who they are. And I think it's probably, I'm kind of curious to see what Sterling and Taika are up to, because I think if anybody could pull it off, it would be those two in sitcom form. So, or whatever it is they're doing. I know it's a TV show. And I'm kind of curious to see, because I think another conduit into normalizing this and depoliticalizing is comedy. It being funny. And there's a lot of funny beats in Blood Quantum, but not the kind of funny that's good natured. So I think there's some inherent politicism to what he's doing too, but I think that's what we were going for, is to normalize. It would be nice to be like, it's a cool zombie movie and it just so happens to be native, opposed to it's a native zombie movie.
Yeah, I think we might have to be normalized in real life before we can get normalized on screen.
Yeah, fucking dare to dream.
Yeah, dare to dream. This was at the time that you made this was the highest budget production, Indigenous production, that had ever been made in Canada. It's as we've been sort of alluding to, for those who haven't seen it, there's lots of arterial spray and blood and guts. On screen. Maybe can you talk about, because it was one of the other aspects I really loved about the film, and because I'm a kid of the 80s, I grew up loving the same filmmakers you did. I love the mix of the practical effects with the digital effects. I love proper zombie disembowelings where you can really get into it. The Tom Savini stuff. Can you talk about the decision, how you struck the balance between what was computer generated and the in-camera effects?
Well, it really broke down to what it is we wanted to show on screen. And it wasn't really at any one point ever one way or the other. It was always going to be an amalgam, because I think kind of get in trouble when you lean one way or the other. It's always going to be, you do practical effects with digital enhancements. And that's kind of the way we approached it. There was no real there was no pure digital images in the film. Everything was comped, or I don't think we built anything. Actually, I say that we might have built the snowblower for the bridge scene, which I don't understand, because we had that fucker on, like, we shot that thing. We had a blade of it. It wasn't on the bridge, but we had it. So for us, it wasn't really, we dealt it on a case-by-case basis. We didn't really set out with any particular idea. It was like, here's the problem, here's the tools we have to solve it, and here's how we're going to approach it. And we were flexible in our budget enough to the point where we had options, but there were some gags that, were hard to pull off, like those give you, for instance, the fucking bite shots that you always see in zombie movies of this flesh tearing. That's not easy to do. That's a hard gag to pull off. So doing stuff like that, I mean, it wasn't easy. And you're kind of picking your shots. It's like, all right, we're going to have the fish. That's going to be our intro. It's going to kick ass. It's going to be cool. We're going to let things settle down for a bit. And then we're going to see your dead baby. And then it's like, things are going to get crazy for a while, and then it's going to settle down for a bit, and then somebody's going to get their head sawed in half, and then it's going to just keep kind of going on like that, and hitting those gags. And then there was a couple of other things, like the beginning of the opening act, when the young lady shows up, or the young girl shows up with her dad. It was like, sure, kill kids, but don't do it on screen. So it became more of showing, it's kind of that Reservoir Dogs thing where almost the enormity of the violence is that much more impactful because you don't see it. That's kind of what we were going for. And I think just the idea that these guys were going to kill a child for the sake of the safety of the people, the perceived safety of the people inside. I mean, you were kind of saying something. I mean, there's a bigger picture of that child getting killed there that didn't need to include actually seeing it. You know what I mean? You don't want graphic violence to overpower the ideas. So that was kind of it. And it was just pacing the zombie stuff out to match some of the more dramatic stuff, and to have it like a crescendo, just keep going up and down, up and down, up and down. And a lot of people think that's kind of uneven, but I've always liked it because I find those scenes play off each other, where I don't think intensity plays as much as if you're going from one fucking crazy scene to another. It's like a Michael Bay movie, and then you can't tell which Transformer is which anymore. I didn't want to do anything like that, and it was just a matter of figuring it out as it went along. There were some gags that we had planned right from the beginning, like the zombie dropping down from the ceiling. Like, we didn't make that up on the day, but for the most part, it was like we picked our shots and we tried to do it cheaply, and we tried to correlate that cheapness with moments like not having seen things on screen. So it's like you can still project that violence into people's mind without actually showing it. So that was our approach. And as for CGI, and like, you do what your budget tells you to do. You know what I mean? Let me fucking tell you something. If you guys are out there right now and you've never dealt with CGI before, it is unreliable, and you think that you can pull off anything that you want. But typically what happens is, like, a lot of CGI guys will promise you the world and, like, deliver a small island instead. So I think you got to take all these things with a grain of salt. But I think a lot of what we did too was create a violent atmosphere where everything seemed to be on fire or red all the time, even before the zombie outbreak. So it was that too, just the atmosphere and the style of the world already seemed very surreal and apocalyptic. Like the final scene, when you see the mom and Charlie and Joss floating off, or Joseph floating off, that was not digitally enhanced at all. It just happened to be that crazy foggy that day. It was like a great big flood, and it was weird. It was like a weird, it's like the land decided to give us free special effects that day.
Well, I hope you offered some tobacco.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we barely got out of there alive that day.
But it strikes me that in zombie movies, there's a few different types of gags, right? Like there's the gags where you want the audience to cheer the violence, like it's like, oh wow, that's awesome. And then there's the stuff like The Baby, where it's actually quite horrific, and you're eliciting a different emotion. So I think that is the right balance.
A guy online described it very well. He said it was mean-spirited, and he's right. It is a mean-spirited movie, and I think people will balk at that. But you remember the Texas Chainsaw Massacres and that earlier shit, man. It's like he was making movies to hurt people, and I think that's kind of what we were doing too. And we were going for like conceptually hard ideas to wrap your head around. Like you have to kill a child to save the environment that you're in now, and mixing them with like just brutal kills and then fun kills, like the zombie falling upside down kind of thing.
Now you did a lot more than just direct this movie. You wrote it. I think you edited it. You did the score on it. You and I've talked about this was a very sort of John Carpenter-like approach to this. I guess the question I would ask is why?
I don't know. I've fucking been asking myself that too the past few months. Initially, it's always to kind of save money and to extend time, because if you can pay me a flat rate, then I can work on it like 24 hours a day if I want to do it straight. So there's no worrying about that. And I think because of the micmac in there, that I need to be there anyway. So it's like, if I know how to push the buttons and I know how to do it. But I felt like this time I got a little exhausted. Whereas Rhymes, I was able to do it. This time I got a little exhausted. And looking at it now, there was things I think I would have benefited from having an extra set of eyes that was an editor. But I mean, I think any artist is always going to say, oh, I should have changed this or that. And the music is always the same. I've been working with the same guy now for about 20 years, making music together. And it's always the same. The first day is just like a fucking tech check to get everything working. Second day, we write songs that we don't use. And third day, we find our themes, and that was it. Once we get our themes, it's just me literally live composing as we're watching the screen, because the setup is like, you know, you have a big giant screen there, and I have all my gear. I might even have posted a couple of shots online on my Instagram, but I have all my stuff there, and I'm just, you know, playing the instruments as we go, and I'm, you know, playing them live as we're watching. So once we get our themes down, it's like we crank out the soundtrack typically in 4 or 5 days. And in this case, it was an hour long. And we were losing the rights to certain songs. Like there was the bridge scene had a certain song that we lost the rights to like fucking 2-3 weeks before the film was going to be released. So we had to stop everything, and I had to go back into the studio and re-record a new song. And then we found out that the song didn't work that I re-recorded, because the original song that we had was an old blues song called You're Gonna Get Sick and Die One of These Days. And it had lyrics, and those lyrics filled up the blank space in the thing. So we ended up having to go back and re-record it. And this is like days before the premiere. So it's crazy because you're doing all that stuff, and we didn't have an assistant editor because we couldn't afford it. And, you know, I'm playing like the fucking 8 different instruments that we're doing, and you're doing that while at the same time trying to finish the CGI, while at the same time trying to lock the edit. And it's crazy. It's crazy. There's a reason why there's like only 4 or 5 filmmakers that do this, because it is crazy. And I can't imagine I can imagine it being a little easier when you have money, because you can hire an assistant editor to do things here and there. But when you don't, man, and you're doing like literally every little nitpicky thing, it is crazy. And it was like, to be 100% honest with you, I'm still recovering. And for me, it was all that creative energy invested into getting the project presentable. And when it was done, I didn't really have much left. So I've kind of been on a hiatus. Like, I haven't written anything for a while. I haven't really done anything too creative besides, you know, draw some pictures with my son. That's it. So I've been recovering for a while. And the weirdest thing, when the film was released, bam, started writing again. Like the bucket's full. There was like some sort of sieve that went off in my brain, where it was like, the audience saying that the film was okay made my confidence show up again.
You've written everything you've directed. Do you ever imagine directing something you didn't write?
Yes. I mean, it would have to be like a perfect project. I sit there saying that I would do this movie in a fucking heartbeat. This has been my dream project for a while. Brave Star. So yeah, I would definitely do it, but it would need to be a really special project, and I would still, I think, need to put my stamp on it. And I think I'm like a lot of auteurs in the beginning, where it's like, oh, I'm gonna write everything myself. And I think doing like 5 different key heads on Blood Quantum knocked that stubbornness out of me a little. So it's like, the other thing I was doing too that I haven't mentioned was I was writing a TV show while I was doing all this other shit too. So I don't know. I think anybody who's tried to write knows how fucking hard it is. And to do it on top of doing all that other stuff was crazy. I don't even know how I did it, to be honest. It seems like, you know, like it happened yesterday, but I don't remember. I remember driving to the studio every day, and I remember like editing, but like how I processed that time, 2 years went by like that.
So why don't we take a look at the questions here to see what we've got here. Okay, so here we go. Here's one. Hi, Jeff. We went to high school together. but I only just learned yesterday that you're making movies these days. Congratulations. Can't wait to have your movie, watch your movie tonight. Any plans to have a physical release for Blood Quantum?
They would mean theaters. I mean, that's that's not my call. I think it would definitely be something everybody wants to experience, but I mean, distribution is not a cheap affair, so I think it's probably going to be a lot of special screenings, like, director attendance screenings, that kind of stuff. So I think it'll definitely be something that happens eventually where you're able to see the film in a theater, because that's what happened with Rhymes. It did like a theater run. It made like $1,000 or something, and then it picked up everywhere else. And then all these special screenings started coming up, like Christ, I Went to Harvard, Georgetown. Like there's a ton of Ivy League schools, a ton of repertory theaters. So I think depending on where you are, well, I guess if you're in Hamilton, we do plan on having a special screening there because we shot it there. So I think that's definitely going to happen.
They're going to love it, Jeff, to see that that little hotel there and the mall burned down. It's fantastic.
The hell's that place called again?
Yeah, is it Howard Johnson or something?
Yeah.
And then anyway, they have a lovely little a 3-screen multiplex in Campbellton, which I think is the perfect setting for this. We've got another question here, Jeff. The color palette for this film was great. How did you think about what color of this world should be?
We looked at it from the perspective of dialing it back to the medieval times. So to us, it was going to be torchlight in the second act. Everything was going to be torchlight. Everything was going to look really medieval. And to me, it was just an aesthetic choice. Actually, we humored the idea very seriously early on of doing it all in black and white. And I'm partially convinced that I'm going to do that one day, do a black and white version. So it was just red, the color red. And we're gonna do stuff like shoot a lot of police cherries, shoot a lot of the back of the car, just anywhere you can get that red in there. The best place it works for me is in the baby scene. You see the red, and it's all just red, and the lights never go off, and the whole thing is like, it's probably my favorite scene in the film because it works so well, and both the actors were on point, and especially when it kind of goes up to the screen. Yeah, those are one of those moments too where we had planned most of that, and the girl playing the zombie too, man. She was like a gymnast or something, so she was like carved out of marble, and kind of kicking Michael's ass a little bit. It's funny. You see it in the shot that we ended up using. He kicked her so hard that she flew to the wall, and that wasn't planned. That's just something they did because they were fighting. And then she launches herself into what's his name, the Sugar character, whose actor name I can't remember right now.
Yeah, well, I'm not gonna remember.
So he's a big guy. Like he's like 6'3" or something, probably 200 pounds if he's an ounce. So she really launched into him. But yeah, I mean that's really what it was. It was going to be like, we knew from the beginning it was going to be a lot of torchlight, and that's a pain in the ass because you don't realize that, but that's an effect. That's not something you can just like, we'll do it in post. And it's all that smoke and all that fire has to be reset every single fucking time you shoot. No idea of how crazy the dynamic was on the set, because it was 100% a film that exceeded the grasp of its budget, but the people working kind of bridged that gap with effort. So it was a grueling shoot in a very cold, dreary part of the year, like last month and the month before, and again in the fall. So it was yeah, I'll remember this one for a while.
You mentioned your cast, and we have a question from Justina Neepin about your cast. Can you talk a bit about the casting process and how it was working with your cast? I loved Elamaya Tailfelder's performance.
It was hard because people take for granted that there's just like a bunch of Indians running around out there. But if you haven't heard, not a lot of them survived. So there's not a lot of actors. There's not a lot of Native actors running around out there, particularly elder Native actors, because it's a young man's game or a young woman's game. And the more you get on in years, I think the less likely you're going to find a Native actor that's survived that long. So whereas casting Kiowa, casting Forrest, that was kind of a no-brainer because both of them are awesome. Casting Olivia was easy too, and it started to become hard when we started looking at Joss's character, when we started looking at Michael's character, the police chief and nurse, and of course, where were we going to find an old man that could do those stunts? And that became like the real, those three became really hard because we had a lot of people to choose from for Michael's character that were really great. And we had a lot of people to choose from for Joss that was really great. And we had fucking nobody for, like nobody existed. We had to find him. And Stonehorse, who's like an old MMA guy, you can actually, if you go back, if you subscribe to the UFC streaming service, you can go back in the season where John Jones was coach and see Stonehorse in the background because he was one of the coaches for The Ultimate Fighter. So that's the extent of his experience on screen. And he does powwows, and so does my family. So we're on the powwow circuit, and he's friends with my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law, and he just shows up one day and he starts showing us these baskets and he starts talking, and my sister sends me a picture and she goes, "You should put him in a movie." And I look at him and he's Stonehorse, man. It's exactly, like, if you didn't know what his name was, you'd name him Stonehorse. So he's there with his tattoos, and she's like, he's an ex-MMA trainer, or not even ex, he still does it. He's an MMA trainer, and he's been doing MMA his entire life. And it's like, Jesus Christ, please can you act? Please can you act? Show off, remember your lines, and just be on screen and look like yourself. And he did. He nailed everything. I mean, for the most part, his inexperience was not an issue at all. And his physicality made it kind of awesome too. And he's kind of hard-headed, right? So there's this scene at the end where Bumper gets stabbed and he has to carry him. And we were like, oh, we can rig him up and do this. And he goes, no, I'll carry him. And Brandon's like fucking 8 feet tall and 200 million pounds. And it's like, we did the take like 3-4 times, and he kept insisting on doing it. And he was just like, he kept carrying him, and didn't complain about the cold, didn't complain about the conditions, didn't understand that actors usually have trailers, it's like all this stuff. And he, by far, he's the Devery Jacobs of Blood Quantum. Where we discovered Devery with Rhymes, we discovered Stonehorse with Blood Quantum. And like, I was so impressed with them. I actually wrote another role specifically for him in the TV show that I was writing. And it's like, you write these roles not knowing that these guys are going to exist. And the idea of a guy out there with actual sword training that looked the way Stonehorse did was a fucking miracle. And again, you talk about serendipity. I'm not a fatalist. I don't read tea leaves. I don't believe in star charts. But everything about this film seems fatalistic and aligned to happen the way that it did. It's very creepy and weird.
Well, I think that's a great tip for all you young Indigenous filmmakers out there. If you're looking to cast, head to the powwow. I mean, that's it. For real. As a matter of fact, you make that joke. That's the first place I met Devery Jacobs, was at the powwow. I'm telling you, powwow. Everything happens at the powwow.
For real. Seeing Brandon at powwows all the time.
We've got another question here. Jesse mentioned that you both have been talking about this idea for a while. So I'm wondering how long this idea has been in the oven, so to speak.
Well, like I said, we came up with it when when the colony was at TIFF, which is I think 2006 or 7. So that's when we came up with it. And a year after that Hotel Eureka, we were pitching at TIFF. We were pitching the script at TIFF. So that was probably 2007. So it took all that time from then till now to realize the film. I made a bunch of other films in between. So it's been a while that, we've been trying to realize the film. And it was actually Todd Brown from XYZ that asked me to dust it off because he had heard me pitch it, and he was like, "Hey, where's that? That's fantastic." And I'm like, well, I kind of gave up on it. And zombie market is saturated. My management is actually the Circle of Confusion, which is one of the producing partners for The Walking Dead, and they were like, "Why do you want to do a zombie movie? It's so saturated." And I'm like, "Trust me, man. It's like it'll be different. It's a zombie movie, but then it's not like a zombie movie like you've ever seen." And then I don't know, these fuckers did it to spite me. They cast Michael in the Fear of the Walking Dead. I'm like, Jesus. It was actually, if there's any one particular strike going against Michael, is that he was in that show. And it was like, do we really want him to be doing this while he was doing that over there? But he ended up being the best read. Like out of everybody that auditioned, he ended up being the best one. And Michael is a fucking sweetheart. Like everybody that we worked with was amazing. I even there was one point where we bounced the camera off of Maya's head, and she was pretty cool about it. And we had to apologize, but everybody was awesome. And it feels like I know for guys like Devery and I and Brandon and I mean, I think we're film family at this point, and I can't see them not being in anything I ever do again. But like you keep adding people to this over the years, and I think Michael's going to be one of those guys, and Maya. And I don't know if people know this, but Maya is quite technically adept director. And I don't know if her latest film really showcases that much, because if you look at some of her older short work, it's almost like she's an action director. So she has sensibilities of a filmmaker also. And that's quite advantageous, because 9 times out of 10, those guys know what you're going through, and they'll give you the least amount of static. And everybody on the set was like that. And it wasn't good conditions. So everybody, if people wanted to complain, I mean, they had more than enough reason to, because like, again, people are billing it as the most expensive native film ever made, but fuck. If anything, that should be a testament to how underfunded we are. Because if you went on that set, you'd see like the stuff. We didn't have the resources we needed to make that film as it was written. So we ended up doing like, I guess every film's like that. You're going to get an approximation of a vision, unless you're like Kubrick and you can fucking convince people to hang around for 200 takes.
So what was your approach to the pacing and the flow of the editing?
It's like, we have these shots and we don't have any other shots. So this is the way the film's going together. That was the editing process. There was no options, really. People listening right now are predominantly going to be low-budget filmmakers. So this idea that you hear David Fincher talking about throwing the stuntman down the steps 16 fucking takes, I mean, that is a pipe dream. You're going to get as many takes as you need to get your scene on screen. And that could just be one. And that's the way we shot. And when you do stuff like that, you save time, you save money. But when you're an editor, you really limit yourself. So really, as a director, editor, you're balancing all these things, knowing it, what you're going to use, and if you don't need it. So after a while, that becomes quite hard to juggle, because the budget keeps eating away at the pacing that you're trying to set. So for me, I think what saved the film to a large extent was the aerial shots, which were shot with a second unit. I wasn't there for those. And that's what kind of slowed the pacing down and made it a little bit more methodical, particularly in the first act. And you don't really see as much of that in the second act. But for me, that's kind of what it was. Talking about Kubrick, you talk about the Full Metal Jacket, and there's a scene in Full Metal Jacket where they go from the regimented training to the kind of chaos of being in Vietnam, and the fucking tonal shift is hard. And that's kind of what we were going for. It was like, all right, you're in a completely new environment, and really, the film is a triptych. First act, second act, third act. You can almost look at them as separate events or separate films, and they're being kind of put together by the act bumpers, the animation act bumpers. So that really, as an editor and as a filmmaker, I did what the budget let me do. And that's going to be your role as a filmmaker, I think, regardless of what your budget is going to be. And I've been lucky over the course of my career that I've had skills that can help the budget and help the film, and really all this stuff plays into everything. I mean, it's really, I mean, it's all being filtered through my workflow and what I do. And what I do is I see the information in front of me and I filter it to what I think is going to be the best result. Because I think, want to make God laugh, show him your fucking shooting script. Show him your storyboard. Because those are the first things that are going to be out the door. And then you're going to be like fucking making shit up for the rest of the day. So to a certain extent, you should almost show up like that.
You mentioned the budget, and don't worry, Jeff. When I say it was the largest budget, when I'm talking to the powers that be, I'm always using this as saying, as a cautionary tale about what the largest budget is, not as the peak where we should go in. But there's a question here about the budget, which I know directors love, but it's a good one. How long did it take to finance the film, and was there any point at which you were worried you wouldn't be able to complete it?
Oh, for sure. We stopped. Like, people, I don't know if you can see it in the film, but we stopped filming because we basically didn't have the money to finish it. Because we were shooting, for the most part, in Montreal. And, like, you don't know this if you're filmmakers, but you get penalized once you go outside your spectrum. Like, there's I forget what they call it. But it's like an area of operation within the city limits that if you go outside of them, you're paying penalties for travel and things like that. So we couldn't find the set for the last act. The church, all that stuff didn't exist. So, well, it didn't exist anywhere else. It didn't exist in the shooting zone of Montreal. So the only place it existed was Listigouche. So we had to go back to Listigouche, and we didn't have the money to do it. So we had to stop. And I had to basically I had to edit what we had, and I had to rewrite the proposal to suit the money we needed in order to finish the film. So funding really took place over the course of a year while we were shooting the film. And we stopped over the course of the summer, raised that money, and it was actually an outside investor that came in from the US that gave us the money to finish the film. So yes, to be honest, I really did believe that the film was kind of up in the air. And it didn't bother me one way or the other. It made me like crazy, fucking off the charts, insanely angry and frustrated. But I felt like I personally did everything I possibly could to get this movie made. I couldn't possibly do anything more besides sell a kidney or, I don't know, start becoming a male prostitute. I don't know, man, because I felt like I gave it my all. And there was a point where I felt like, it wasn't going to be finished. And it was like a real stark reality until we found out that we got the rest of our funding like a few days before we were going to start shooting again. And I don't even know what the plan was, to be honest, because it was like, we don't have the money. How are we going to start shooting? Everybody's just shrugging their shoulders, and it's like, we'll make it work. So it was I think pretty typical of any financing structure for a film, where it's like you beg, borrow, and steal until you get there.
So of all the roles that you did on the show, writer, director, editors, doing the music, which was the most fun?
Music, easy, hands down, no brainer. Music, absolutely. because I am if I could rate my artistic talent, it goes like this: writer, musician, everything else, and down here at the bottom, filmmaker. It's like my least talent that I have. So it's actually like it's counterintuitive to my personality to go out and tell people what to do and be the center of attention. It makes me uncomfortable. So I don't particularly think I'm good at it, and I wouldn't say I'm emotionally distant, but when remember the story about Robert Polanski talking to Faye Dunaway, and Faye's asking him about, what's my motivation? And he goes, your fucking paycheck is the motivation. That's me. So when I start talking about like the subtle nuances of characterization, I need time to do that, because you need to bond with the person. And I think in this particular case, we didn't actually have that time. Whereas with Devery, we did. Like we had a month working up to the shoot. So I think I'm kind of rambling. I don't even. What did she ask me again?
Oh, just what was the most fun? I think you answered. You're a musician.
Yeah, the music. Because like I've been a musician my entire life, and there's something about putting music to images that is just it is a beautiful feeling for me, because I experience music as a listener even when I'm playing it. Like I don't think it's weird. You know what I liken it to? Do you know when you talk on a recording and you hear your voice and it doesn't sound like you? That's exactly the way I feel like when it's my music. I don't feel like that atmosphere and mood can come out of me. And
yeah.
I don't
try and be on radio for 25 years.
So I think for me, it all starts emotionally coming together when you start doing the music, because they're cues, man. They're like emotional cues for the audience. Like, oh, you're supposed to feel sad here. Oh, you're supposed to feel, funny or whatever. So I think, easily for me, even this time where we didn't have a lot of time to do a soundtrack, I felt like just experimenting, doing a synth soundtrack where we never really did that since we were like in college. So, doing predominantly keyboards, I'm a better guitar player than I am a piano player. So I have a tendency to really lean on my guitar playing. And for some other reason, keeping with the concept of making it hard on myself as I possibly could, it's going to be like, all right, I'm not a good piano player, so let's do it all by keyboard.
So we've got time for a couple more here. This is a good one. In the second acts of both Rhymes and Blood Quantum, you have giant parties. Can you talk about why these scenes matter to you?
Because I experienced this growing up on the reserve, navigating parties, waking up to parties and drunken people everywhere, and seeing the parties, and it's a huge part of my experience growing up on a reserve. And to this day, it's like the first thing you do when you get down there is you go hang out with everybody and you have yourself a little social gathering. But these big parties, they're really reminiscent of my grandmother's on the reserve. And there was a bar in our house. Actually, there was a bar in our house, and there was like a little stand and stage sometimes for people to come and play music and sing. And so there was quite a lot of that going on, a lot of drunken revelry. So I think a lot of Native people have experienced that. And I think it's a huge part of our social upbringing to see gatherings like that. So for me, they're a big part of the social structure of being on a reserve. And I just can't imagine setting a film on a reserve without having a scene like that. Because reserves like to party, go to powwow, and like wait till the weekend. Like it's I think that's why. And I think the other thing too, it's kind of to showcase an almost self-destructive quality to these people, regardless of the situation they're in. It's almost I think I labeled it as the art of forgetfulness. And I think that's really what it's about. Sure, it's a party, but at the same time, it's showing these people wanting to forget the background are fine.
And then there's a good question about the animation. Can you talk about the choice to include the animated, the real, not just the CGI effects? I mean, I'm talking about the actual animated sequences in the film.
We wanted to do certain things that were in the script. There was like when, like the opening scene would be a good example. When he guts the fish, certain things were supposed to fall out, like fingers, and like the fish was supposed to be pregnant, because you wanted to bring in that imagery of I wanted to introduce that imagery of there being something wrong with pregnancies early on. So we couldn't shoot that because we didn't, like, logistically it seemed crazy, and the beats would have already been covered with just the fish coming back to life. So it was a matter of how do we bring in some of the connotation of what we're trying to do here, and that's show the industry of the area, because it's a very industrial area. There's the mill over there, and then the structure that you see the last stand take place on is actually an old mill too. So the whole area, that whole area is really, really old and industrial. And I just wanted to show how that area was polluting the people, polluting the land, which in turn, you know, polluted which in turn caused the zombie apocalypse, without actually directly saying that's what it was. And same thing with Lysol. Lysol at one point was supposed to have, like, the compound was supposed to be at the church. So at the church there was supposed to be like almost a murdering hole, or like you bring in the zombies or people that were bit and you kill them and you bury them there. So what you see is the idea is still playing out in the animation sequence with Lysol, where you see the pyres beside him and you see them in front of the church, getting the impression that he's been implementing a final solution for the refugees, if you will. And there was going to be a lot of that imagery too, right? Like piles of shoes and stuff like that. So we still wanted to bring in that imagery and those ideas, but obviously we could shoot them. So it was like, all right, let's just have these little animation bumpers. And the guys that did it are an animation place here. Another really highlight for me was working with them, because Daniel at ED Films is a fucking god. Like, this guy is like, he's a kindred spirit. Like, when I first met him, his whole office was like almost exactly set up as mine, filled with instruments, a computer, and like his drawing pad. So it was like we started talking. I was supposed to be there talking about the film, but we just started geeking out about all the stuff in the office. So he was a real kindred spirit, and doing the animation with him, I cannot wait to work with him again, because those guys, they hit it out of the park. And I find that those sequences elevate the content of the rest of the film, which is exactly what they were meant to do. Put everything that you were looking in the context of an allegory. By the way, you're still watching a movie. Do not take these Indians at face value. That's another thing too, where I feel like as a native filmmaker, you almost need to tell an audience that, like, these aren't real people. They're just made up. You should give us the benefit of, you know, not thinking that every Indian you see on screen is representative of, you know. And of course I say that touting myself as the, like, ultimate authentic native director, but I've always maintained the idea that the second you slap a frame on something is manipulating that image, and there's no getting around that. So I'd rather just embrace that and not try to depict any kind of hyper reality, but reinterpret the allegory for genre films. I mean, that's essentially what I do.
So I'll ask you one more, and I just want to end with, you know, thanking you again, Jeff, for this movie. You know, for me, you know, it was a dream come true watching it. You know, as a kid growing up, I always imagined, as a kid who was obsessed with zombie movies, as an adult who still subscribes to Fangoria magazine, I was just thrilled that to see this and to see an indigenous zombie movie. It was so was like a dream come true and very inspiring, and you remain very inspiring to me and to, I think, a lot of Indigenous artists. So there was a question about a young Indigenous artist asking about wanting to make a film about the violence that the Wet'suwet'en have faced recently. And I guess I would just ask you in closing, for Indigenous filmmakers out there who haven't yet had the opportunity to work in the way you have, what would your advice be to them in terms of how best to realize their stories and how to navigate through the system and achieve their vision like you've been able to on screen?
Become obsessed, become pathological, make your every fucking breath you draw in your life about perfecting your art. That's what I do. You can't see it here, but like if you turn around, this entire wall is filled with books. Read, draw, write, play music, saturate yourself in the form of whatever it is you're trying to achieve and get as good at that as you possibly can. Because you know what? You're not going to be afforded to be just okay. You're going to need to be the best at what you do. So in order for me to have gotten here, I had to be a writer, director, editor, filmmaker, the guy who raises money. And along that path, you're going to have a lot of twists and turns. But know this, if you stay on it, you will get there. You just need to stay on it. You can't get distracted by race shit, to put it bluntly. You can't get distracted by peripheral drama that comes with being a Native person in the 21st century. And you have to stay single-minded and plowing towards that goal. And it sounds real romantic, but it isn't. It's, people ask me like, well, how you doing with the quarantine? I can't tell the fucking difference because this is the way I've lived my life for the past 20 years because I've been working on nothing but films. And to be an editor, composer, writer, all this shit, you need to devote your time. And that's it. I have a friend of mine, he's like, it's like being a priest. You don't stop being a priest when you take off your collar. You're just out, you're a priest all the time. And a filmmaker is like that. You have to be a certain kind of crazy to devote your life to this and realize that it's going to take a lot out of you. And you need to know you have it to give. For me, the way I look at every project is it's going to get done. So I might as well show up and do it. Because filmmaking at a certain point becomes a monster where it's going to get finished with or without you. Like you hear stories about Bryan Singer walking off set in the middle of a production. That movie got finished with or without him, There's so many films, the act of getting them off the ground, it becomes the driving force in getting them done. I mean, that's why you have Ian Insurance. That's why you have like finishing bonds. I mean, it's like, I guess the other thing you should do too is ask whether or not you want all this. Hey, you want to come say hi? And having people like this to do it for helps. So he's going to bed. That's Jesse. These are all the people I'm talking to.
But how many people are there?
53. Right, yes. Night.
Bed.
Sorry. It's bedtime, 8:30.
Don't ever apologize for that, man.
So yeah, I mean, that's it. It is not romantic. It is not romantic, but romanticize the idea. I think it would be a better way to put it.
I think that's great advice, and I've know many, many artists and directors, and they all are similarly devoted to their craft. I'd give you a kiss if I was there too, brother. I love you. Thank you so much for making this movie. Thanks for this conversation. Hans, I think we're all done there, unless you got anything else to say. But Jeff, congratulations on the release. It's so thrilling. And again, miigwech, 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 chi miigwech.
Thank you, Will.
Absolutely amazing. And thanks to both of you. Thanks so much, Jeff and Jesse. That was mind-blowing. That was fantastic. And for those of you who haven't seen Blood Quantum yet, look for it now wherever you rent films digitally. Take advantage of the fact that you can actually just go and watch it right now.
I know, right?
Absolutely. Go do it. It's amazing. Tune in tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern when we are hosting direct from Denmark, I think. He's somewhere out there. Two-time Oscar-nominated Syrian documentary director of Last Men in Aleppo and The Cave of Ras Fayyad, moderated by renowned DGC documentary filmmaker Christy Garland. It's going to be absolutely incredible. You should have received an invitation, and if not, let me know. I'll send it to you. And next Thursday, in our usual time slot, tune in for our masterclass with two-time Oscar-winning sound editor for James Bond Skyfall and Bourne Ultimatum, Karen Baker Landers. Wait for the invitation and links on Tuesday next week. It continues to be a great ride, and we hope it's providing some relief and entertainment and inspiration in these strange and challenging times. Be safe, be well, be kind. Jeff and Jesse, thanks again. That was absolutely incredible. And good night to everybody.
Good night.